Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest chapter of Ars Magica, taken from the subreddit HFY. All the relevant links are down below, and please like, comment, and subscribe like any good minion of the algorithm would do. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 79. Credence looked around the workshop, because in his mind he could think of nothing else to call it. When the old bat had first invited him in, at first he had simply thought that it was a rustic cabin. Of course, the metal exterior was much the same as the composition of the interior, but that did not mean that the details of the metal did not give way towards that illusion. For a while the gleam of the metal shined off the floating lights throughout the establishment. The grooves within the floor and walls looked much like old oaken wood. The stones which lined the fireplace did look like stones, and the chairs within the center of the first room, while seeming to be made out of wicker, were also much the same. Credence had questioned on whether or not this was an effective workshop or not. It wasn't until now named Bat Stellan had redirected him towards the somewhat hidden hallway waylaid onto the dark recesses of the room, actively pushing away prying eyes. He did keep his previous reservations. At the end of the hallway lay 3 doors, one of which was barred. Considering the fact that the seams of the doors almost seemed welded shut, Credence could tell that there was a story there, although he had not thought to ask questions of his host, given he still does not know exactly the reason he's here. However, his reservations fell away as Stellan opened one of his doors. There, that lay beyond it, was the most definitely the workshop. Tools lined along the walls within this section of it, hung up on racks. Some were familiar to him, while others were things that he could scarcely afford. Tentatively, he reached out to touch it. "You're more than welcome to inspect my tools. Just make sure that you do not touch them for too long, though." The bat let out as he came in behind towards the workbench, set off to the side of the room away from the door. Credence hesitated at his words before slowly taking away his scaled hand, away from the wall, and slowly turning away from the tools lying above the cabinet, towards the other side of the room. "Why?" Credence questioned. "Well, a lot of them are made up of material that the dungeon has provided me. I was only to keep some of my original tools, as most of them were, consumed." For a second, the bat's words did not seem to resonate within his mind. However, a flash of insight came to him, along with a memory of the dungeon feasting, or at least trying to feast, upon his creation. A healthy fear sprouted in his mind as he resigned himself to not touch the tools that lay in front of him, no matter how madly he wanted to investigate some of the mechanical designs and secrets. "Sounds, hard to deal with," he supplied, as he stepped away from the wall. "Ha! Like you wouldn't believe," the bat chuckled, as it started to take off the tools along the wall and picking up the unseen box that lay hidden underneath the workbench and placing it next to his tools. Credence could barely see what was within the box, but the number of blinking lights and clunking sounds that occurred as the Dwem worked on them gave him a fair bit of knowledge towards what might be complicated subject matter to touch upon later. Credence, however, wondered a fair bit as to why he was brought to this person's apparent sanctum. "So, this is all fairly impressive, but—" "You want to know why I brought you here?" Stellan interjected. "Yes, I would be appreciative," Credence answered, nodding all the while. However, even with his agreeable nature, Stellan saw something rather fearful in his gaze. "You seem to be under the misconception here still. You are not a prisoner here. The exit is just beyond that 3rd door," Stellan explained, as he pointed out towards the door. However, his attention was rapidly diverted as some parts had fallen to the floor in the sweep of his arm. "The one that's welded," Credence suggested. Stellan sighed as he picked up pieces off the floor and put them back onto the table. "No, I'm not that cruel towards your stay here. That's the way to the core room. Buried Legion has to have a way towards his core at all times. It's just his nature. I figured this might provide extra defense in case of some challenges to the dungeon. As of right now, he doesn't." The bat stops and looks around the little bit of the room, its eyes particularly focusing upon the golem lying on the pedestal in the corner. For a second, silence fills the room. But Stellan leans in and continues on in a whisper. It doesn't know that the door doesn't work. If it did, it would go slightly crazy, I believe. The way the bat spoke, almost with a wistful look, made the lizard believe that perhaps something like this had happened before with Stellan. He would take the advice where he could, but something caught his eye, a slight trembling upon the bat's knees when it tried to stand back up again, and a wince across its features, almost like the thought of such past incident physically hurt him inside. You really care about him, don't you? Credence's question pulled Stellan's attention away from his current task. Slowly, he's walked down to a crawl as he went towards his welding station opposite the door. Its height almost equal towards the bat's minuscule own. The item in his grasp almost slipped from it entirely. However, a firm grip came back to firmly grasp the loosening paper article. Of course, he's my landlord. If he's gone, I can't live here anymore. The bat scoffed as he put the now apparent amulet into the welder. He reached over towards the side of it, looking for something, before managing to pull out a few pieces of paper that lay behind the machine. As he carefully looked over it, on the table in the center, Credence studied his face. He couldn't quite be sure whether or not his previous emotions were simply a lie to him, or just a self-delusion. So he went with the safe option of avoiding the issue entirely. Practical. Oh, don't get me wrong. I like him all the same, but there is so much you cannot connect with such a different being like that. He was waving his wings beside him, as he brought the paper back into a roll and went back to the welder, flicking something along the underside of it, producing a noticeably large azure flame within the middle of the runic inscription circle that lay directly in the middle of the contraption. As he put the amulet within the center, and as the flame seemed to cause the entire object to glow blue, Credence considered that this was enough dancing around the original question which started this whole conversation. So, what did you bring me here for? The kobold restated. The bat was struck stiff as he realized that the question had laid unanswered. He turned around, leaving the item upon the circle, forgetting entirely as it began to melt off to the side of it. Credence looked at it, quite concerned, before the bat's words drew his attention. Right, I need your second opinion on something. At that, Stellan walked away towards the corner of the room, gesturing towards the red dice on the column that laid upon it. Ta-da! My finest creation! Stellan exclaimed. Credence could only stare, waiting for an apparent punchline that never came. Hey, Gollum, isn't that, not that hard to make? The kobold asked. The bat stared at the exclamation, and its entire body twitched. However, it was only a little bit before the smile came back upon his face, as bright as ever. Naturally, you'd be right. However, this is quite different. Buried Legion, could you demonstrate to our visitor? He said, as he took a claw and tapped upon the metal golem's frame. For a second, nothing happened, and Credence simply thought perhaps the dungeon was supposed to provide a requisite material. However, his doubts towards what was supposed to happen were put to rest as the entire room rumbled. At first, he had thought that perhaps a fissure would form, just like during the impromptu tea party they had had earlier. However, when he saw the walls begin to rumble like they were made of water, he had a different thought occur to him. He warily looked downwards to see that the floor was moving the same way. However, the ripples, now seeming like they had all come from one thing, rather than just random noise from the earth. It all congealed until pulses went through the entire room. Credence began to have a lot of fear as the ripple began moving. No, it's fine, just wait, Stellan interjected, as he put a hand to the kobold's mouth, barely missing the possibility of being bitten. Credence still, as the ripple moved underneath the dais, the metal filling in grooves as visible waves of grey energy rippled through the metal in the dais, and thus into the golem construct. Credence thought that, perhaps, it was simply providing power, but once the rippling stilled and the construct's eyes had opened, his thoughts were put again into question. Hello there, the golem spoke, its eyes glowing neon as it moved its head in Credence's direction. For a second, Credence did not breathe and did not understand. Then it came crashing onto him as a tone resounded as a gong through his head. Oh, Credence said in surprise, because, of course, it was a surprise. There were not many dungeons that were able to have physical form, only ever having their main core be their primary means of communication. Having this in front of him was one of the rarest sights. Most likely, he had only ever seen this kind of thing once again, if he ever decided to go into the capital's main dungeon, if his travels continued the way he thought they might. Yes, but that's not the best part. Watch this, okay. Buried Legion, I want you to try their practice exercise that we've been going through. Try Flame and Frost for it, yeah? Stellan happily exclaimed. Will do. Give me a moment. The dungeon spoke. At first nothing seemed to occur. Then a noticeable shift in the air occurred as heat began to suffuse their surroundings. Credence could only watch as fire engulfed the mechanical marvel, slowly replacing the metal of its frame and giving him an energized wave of energy. Before the fire fell away from its surface and the flame transformed back into metal, frost began to form, cold as ice along the surface, slowly replacing the metal, much like the fire before it. And the lizard's breath came unbidden to his mouth. Dear gods, this is... Could it be? Credence stuttered at the one-in-a-million invention. He was rightfully impressed, given the fact that the golem cores could only ever have one energy source associated with its life. Once something was given an affinity, that was it. It was all it could resonate with. If one did not have any of the matter associated with it, it would only ever be an inert core, never to be filled with life or the elements applied to it. Sure, only having a core would allow an elemental to naturally form, but only true golems would ever have a frame, keeping the core of their powers safe and unused for long periods of time. He had surely expected that had been the case before the frame had changed, and his slight admiration at the construct had turned to awe. For a frame to change as such to its respective element, on the golem's own wishes no less, would give it more power than any natural elemental, as its core would not be able to be a much higher state. Images went through his mind as fast as he could conjure them on what he could do with such a technology. His lobster mech could become one with land, air, and sea, finally becoming the ultimate transportation vehicle. Mining equipment could perform exceptionally better at the behest of experienced operators. Agriculture would explode as a wave of new druid sciences would be developed towards any nature-attuned calls of its type. Then his thoughts turned towards improvisationists, and his gleaming smile subtly turned downwards. It would be the same as golems without controllers, essentially free Hypatia, who could be whatever they wanted, so long as they understood how to shift their natural chroma. Thankfully, there was only one in front of him, so he was hoping that perhaps the bat would answer his unspoken question as his voice failed him. Of course, my friend. My blueprints are lying upon the desk over there. You'll need them to see the problem I'm having. His eyes gleamed at Stellan's words as he rushed towards the table and began ruffling through the papers until his attention found what he was looking for. However, briefly, he wondered whether or not his skill was high enough to do this. He had, of course, not used it in a while, considering he never found any blueprints within the desert, and scrolls of knowledge were hoarded by many tribes that lay out there. So, with slight hesitation and a hope in his heart, he activated Impart Knowledge. Searching for repository of knowledge, blueprint for polychromatic golem core found. Blueprint for infusion frame found. Blueprint for infusion dais found. Imprinting upon mind, done. Understanding components, done. Polychromatic golem core available for usage under build construct skill types. Infusion frame unavailable for usage, no applicable skill type. Infusion frame lost. Infusion dais available for usage under mystical array skill types. His eyes wandered, taking the information put into his brain, and then interactions between his skills and the blueprints became apparent. He tuned out all unnecessary information, not hearing the quiet discussion between the dungeon and the long-time inhabitant. However, that was insignificant to him as he expressed his gratitude. Thank you, this will surely change. However, his thanks died in his mouth as he realized something. The connections of mana conductive materials used were made up of something that he couldn't explain, almost like it was a metal made up of tiny golem cores the size of a nail's head, connected with streams of some kind of flowing metal called Lbry. This metal amalgamation could not be naturally occurring in veins or any kinds of deposits. This was something that had to be manufactured, that could only be here within this part of the dungeon, he realized, as the entire room was covered in the stuff. However, that wasn't the main surprise he had as he looked and flipped through the blueprints in his system. "You see the issue now, don't you?" Stellan spoke, finally grabbing Credence's attention away from the main problem that occurred within the side. "The chroma, it doesn't..." "Yes, because of the nature of this metal. It naturally dissipates, works even faster for a complex chroma, which has been stumping me for months on end. It's only recently that I've even managed for it to work for something as complex as space." Credence took in the bat's words as the dungeon climbed down from the dais, finally noticing the twin energy colors within the golem's main giant core. He looked at them and noticed that the light they gave off was slowly but surely dwindling, showing the exact nature of the problem. If this could not be solved, the entire design would be pointless. Briefly, he wondered how exactly the metal encapsulated the concept of space, before shaking his head. Further trepidation took hold of him, as he grasped with how much effort this must have taken from the little dwemer. "This is something beyond my understanding." "Low level?" Credence started at Stellan's question before scoffing. "Compared to you, probably. I've been more focused on developing talent rather than simply my skills and levels." Credence hastily responded as he dove back into the physical documents, hoping that perhaps his skill had missed something due to its being below average level. However, his words sparked Stellan's eyes, causing the dwemer to widely grin. "Ah, a long road ahead of you, especially with that," Stellan said as he gestured towards all of the kobold. "You don't need to say my age will be a problem. I know of it. I also know that it's only improper way to go," Credence stated, somewhat miffed at the perceived insult towards his training methods. No, I agree with you. I'm the same in that regard," Stellan quickly denied. Credence looked up from the table towards Stellan, noticing the sincerity in his words. He stared into the eyes as the dungeon came to rest beside the lizard, finally giving in to the truth of his words. However, this gave him another thought as to ask the dwemer as he considered on what he was going to do from now on. "How long did it take you to, get where you are now?" I don't rightly know. I used a lot of chronomancy artifacts to get where I am." The mention of the dangerous school of magic poked up the lizard. Artifacts, like their name suggests, were most likely just old artificer equipment that stood the test of time using magics powerful enough to keep it that way. "Chronomancy? There are still artifacts holding their power?" Credence queried. Stellan briefly stated at the mention of it before nodding, realizing something about a second later, and then shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. The last of the chroma in the one I had faded away not 10 years ago. Can't speed up my intelligence anymore, I'm afraid," he said, flippantly waving a wing. The dungeon stayed silent, sitting off to the side, as it tilted its head towards the lizard. Credence could tell that it was inspecting something about him, but he could not tell what. The mention of the chroma of time fading away brought a brief speck of hollowness within him, as he realized he could not share in its effects. However, he brought forth the question that he was avoiding answering, the one he knew the bat was wishing upon him. Should he help the dwemer? It's not like there isn't any danger towards this effort if any others found out. That thought, however, brought to mind exactly where they were. A dungeon. He stared at the bat, and as it began to speak, he knew what his answer would be. "So, are you willing to help me accomplish this? If this is publicly available instead of just ordered by the nobility, yes, I can see the benefit. I may not be able to offer much, but I'll help you. For a day at least. I need to leave so that I might find the rest of my caravan." The bat smiled, and Credence remarked that it almost looked like the devil's fanged gleam. He could only hope that finding his friends for all the betterment of the world was worth it. Vaguely, he caught sight of the column, the dungeon, to the side, emulating the non-verbal sigh of relief. "Don't worry, you'll only be here for a day, my friend. I promise you that." End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.